Hello and welcome to Sotheby's in London, where we are going to get a first peek at some of the masterpieces from the Macklowe Collection, which are going on sale at Sotheby's in New York in May. It really is an extraordinary collection, probably one of the greatest collections of modern and contemporary art ever assembled. It contains 65 works, 35 of which were sold in November in Sotheby's in New York. The remaining 30 go on sale in spring, and we get to look at the highlights. To help us explore this marvellous room of art, I've asked my colleague, the curator Eleanor Nairne, to join us.
Hi, Will.
So, this is your period, right? You curated the Jean-Michel Basquiat show at the Barbican, the Lee Krasner show, the Dubuffet show. So what do you make of a room full of art like this?
It's a pretty extraordinary experience. I mean, the Macklowe Collection is obviously one of the finest examples of post-war modern art in America. And this is an opportunity for us to see these rare examples of work by Polke, Richter, Warhol, Dubuffet, the Rothko behind me, which has never been exhibited before. It feels like quite a moment.
So where do we start?
Maybe the Warhol?
Great choice. So this is one of Warhol's famous fright wig images from 1986, all taken from a Polaroid, aren't they?
Exactly. Yeah. So the process would normally be that he'd take a Polaroid in the studio. He's at East 33rd Street at this point. Then it would be sent off to a lab, sent to be enlarged, then transferred onto acetate, and then you'd have the silkscreen process. So there's quite a lot of kind of careful decision that goes into the composition. And it has quite an unnerving feel to it. And of course, we can't help but look at it and think of the fact that Warhol was to die only 9 months later in February of '87.
There is an element of a death mask about it. And what's with all the camouflage? What's going on there?
The camouflage is fascinating because, of course, we think of Warhol as a man who's all about persona. So all about that sense of the interior and the exterior self, ideas of celebrity, whether we can ever get to know the true Jackie. Camouflage is designed to conceal us from enemy combat. So who exactly is he trying to protect himself from within this image? There's a sense of both playfulness and also ambivalence about how we're meant to read that camouflage.
And of course, you know, because it's Warhol, it is an image of an image of an image of an image, but it also sits within a body of work.
It really relates to Warhol's interest in the still life, the idea that all life is fleeting, the sense that we are but mortal beings. You know, these were all ideas that he was playing with within this body of self-portraits, which were begun in '64 and continued right throughout the rest of his career.
And what about the fright wig itself? You know, obviously we all know Warhol had these hundreds of wigs, but the fright wig became a specific thing, right?
Well, it really points to Warhol's performative relationship to identity and to that sense of playfulness that he's presenting himself here in a way that is unbelievably striking, immediately captures attention. The fright wig and the camouflage come together in that questioning of who we're seeing in this persona.
And this notion that he said everything was superficial, that what you see is what you get, and yet here he is removing himself from the image.
Warhol's famously saying, everything is surface. Anything you want to know about me is right there on the surface of my paintings. And yet here he is troubling our capacity to see beyond that surface.
So we can go from the high master of American pop to a European artist who drew heavily on that pop sensibility. And that is Sigmar Polke, the German artist, born in East Germany, then went over to West Germany. For me, it reminds me a little bit of early Magritte, and a little bit of late Baldassare. Am I mad?
No, they're really interesting connections, and I think it's kind of astonishing to think that Polke was 23 when he made this painting. The really striking thing is that we have, as you said, these pop sensibilities, these very highly keyed colours, these very alluring objects, but then very noticeably these blank areas of the canvas, just with the graphite marks of the grid. And it's hard to know quite how he wants us to interpret this, whether it's about the idea of desire and a space between the allure of objects and how they're being presented in glossy magazines in this period in the early 60s, and the actual reality in post-war Germany. You know, this is an artist who fled from East Germany when he was 12 and who would have experienced very much firsthand the reality of scarcity during that period in post-war Germany. So you really have that sense of the contrast between these two areas of the canvas and that sense of how they reflect a contrast in life.
And he's there, isn't he, with Beuys and with Richter, with that big challenge, which is how do you reinvent German art after the Second World War? And he's come from the East, he's come into the West, into consumerism. And I just sense with this painting, he's exploring those ideas.
Sometimes the artist would refer in Germany to the idea that they were trying to grow in poisoned soil. And I think that's very interesting when we look at these as generic objects, but for washing, for cleaning. You know, who is trying to clean their post-war image? Soap traditionally is made out of ash. You know, there's all these kind of layering of what might be going on within that imagery. And the question of what does it mean to be an artist? Can you complete a canvas? You know, Adorno's famous line is, can there be any poetry after Auschwitz? And in a way, this is such a clever, critical way of answering that question.
But also, crucially, with Polke, always with Polke, it's witty.
Yes.
It's funny. It doesn't take itself too seriously.
Absolutely. And I think we see that in many ways too with the Copyist from '82.
I love this painting. Well, this is an epic painting in every way, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting that Polke had stopped painting for a while, hadn't he? And he'd only just come back to it. And here we have sort of the artist looking at the role of an artist looking at the role of an artist. So we've got the Copyist down here, which is the artist traditionally who would go to the museums and spend hours, days, weeks, months copying the great works. And this looks a bit like a Turner or a Poussin, doesn't it? And yet it's so far from that. It's so viscerally contemporary. He's giving us no out, really. You know, just everything pulls you into this painting, whether it's you're taking the artist's view into the town, or you just lift your eyes and you look up into that amazing skyscape where he's used varnishes to create the glow of the sun. And these weird reds, if you come in close, and they just ping out of the canvas, a bit like Turner's red on that famous Boy all those years ago. And so it seems to me like it's an homage to the history of art, and it's a challenge to contemporary art. The painting isn't dead. Painting is still alive. It's still got something to say.
You know, you have that sense with a picture like this, which is just materially so rich. You know, we've got these dense kind of moments of powdered pigment. We've got these varnishes and glazes, like you've said. We know that at this point he's using quite a lot of solvents as well to be able to draw away pigment from the canvas. So it's a very rich image to look at. And that was one of the reasons why Polke had such a coterie of admirers amongst fellow artists, because they saw him as someone for whom nothing was too sacred. So on the one hand, we have an incredibly experimental image, and at the same time, we have, as you say, this figure of the copyist, as if he's simply reproducing things that have been made before. So it's really dramatizing that essential question that's there for every artist about the tension between originality and history and what has gone before, and how much any artist can ever reach beyond what has already been put down in the books, the annals of history.
And as you say, there's a playfulness with medium and with material in this, which makes me think of the other great German artist in this collection and his great friend, Gerhard Richter. Polke and Richter, of course, have quite a lot in common. They were both born in East Germany. They both came over to the West. They both trained in Düsseldorf. And they set up this thing together, didn't they? This sort of this group.
Capitalist realism.
Capitalist realism. So what is capitalist realism?
I think it was their way of thinking through what painting might be in this post-war moment. You know, we've just been talking about Polke's experiment with materials and his kind of sense of play and alchemy within the studio. And here we have such a different kind of image, Richter's seascape, in which it seems to be all about photorealism. What can we trust? Where is veracity? Is this an authentic image for us to lay our eyes on? And of course, Richter's from Dresden, so is Caspar David Friedrich. You know, this is clearly an allusion to Constable Cloud studies. We've got some of the luminescence of Turner in this. Again, we're in very clever, witty, painterly territory.
You could, I suppose, talk about this picture speaking to the sublime, speaking to German romanticism, but there is this thing about Richter always, which is very much his thing, which is the blur, the blurred lines, the slightly out of focus. What's that all about?
It's a great question, and immediately in my mind is rendered the back of Betty's head. And
Exactly.
I think, we have to see it as some kind of comment about perception. What are we able to see? How closely can we look? Can we come into focus on any singular image? And much like Polke, when we scratch the surface, does it fall away? So I think there's that engagement with the questions around authenticity, which is part of what has meant that Richter's had such an enduring legacy.
And I suppose it's also this notion of that nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent, which is what he experienced. And in a way, I think there's sort of a Monet-type spirit to this. Monet looked deep down into a pond to give a landscape where you can see land. And here's another landscape where you can't see land, but you're looking up. So semi-abstract. But to get to the fully abstract, we need to go to another European painter, but this time a European painter who went to America, Mark Rothko.
So for me, this is one of the most exciting works in the collection. An untitled Rothko from 1960, such an important moment, just a year after he'd made the Sigmar murals that he'd then decided to withdraw, luckily for us in the UK, because that's how they came to be in the Tate collection. And this is a work that's never been seen publicly before, so I have to work a bit to contain my excitement. And of course, we think of Rothko at this point as he's really kind of deepening his palette. We were talking about Romanticism in relation to Richter, and of course, Rothko had that much more bright, highly keyed colour palette in the mid-50s.
The yellows, the reds, the mauves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a kind of different sort of register, emotional register happening. Here we have these tones that are like oxidized blood or a bruised flesh. They're very, very emotive colours. And of course, he's beginning to play with some different techniques in the studio. So he's using these very, very thin layers of paint, glazes in between, sometimes these egg yolk glazes.
Up to 18 layers sometimes, aren't they?
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
And that was one of the things that came out from Tate doing the restoration work on one of the Sigmar murals, was having those conservators able to show how complex the layering of a painting like this is. And of course, he always wanted them to be lit in this very dramatic twilight, because he wanted the colour to do what colour does naturally in the gloaming, to kind of slightly come off the background.
Exactly. The way he feathers the edges, just so elegantly and delicately done, which makes these forms hover, just brings them off the picture plane somehow and gives them a life of their own and draws you in. And I don't know, there was always this thing with Rothko, which he wanted you to feel his paintings as much as you looked at them. They were, I think for Rothko, a sort of a conversation. He was, I think to a certain extent, he wanted to be, the viewer's soulmate.
Yeah, and he was extraordinarily effective in that regard. I think of a note that he wrote in 1960 about the Sigmar murals, where he said there was always the hope that I would paint something they could not endure, that he would make a painting so charged with emotional energy that it couldn't sit as the backdrop to a restaurant in a posh building,
right,
that it needed to be in a quieter space where somebody could really commune with it. And of course, we think of the Rothko Chapel and these more spiritual dimensions to the work. And he really was an extraordinary force with that regard.
Eleanor, you were quite rightly waxing lyrical about the Rothko, and I can do something very similar about the de Kooning. I absolutely love his work from this period, early 60s. He's moving out to East Hampton. And actually, it was a de Kooning from this period, which is in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, that actually made me fall in love with art. It's called Rosie-Fingered Dawn at Last Point. And it's absolutely beautiful. And this is very similar. It hasn't got the same whites in that painting, but it's got the same poetic structure, where he's completely gone away from figuration. And this is a landscape. There's a sea, there's a sand, there's a sun, and there's an ebullience and a joy and a painterliness to this, which makes it just sing. He is, for me, the closest you get to poetry with paint. It is just so rhythmical and sensuous. It is quite extraordinary. You have to stand, I think with these paintings of de Kooning's, you have to be in the space, in the place with them. You have to see and feel the impasto paint. You have to see and feel the texture of those swooping lines he makes, those big broad brush strokes, and then how it's all organised into this sort of epic cacophony of a painting about somewhere he clearly loves and is expressing that love with such a passion. I think they're amazing paintings.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's a moment in de Kooning's practice when, he's had the Great Sydney Yanis show in 1959. Right. It sells out within a week. It's the money from that sale that allows him to buy land in Springs, Long Island, this great famous beacon for artists, including Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, who were drawn there because of the quality of the light, that diffusion of light. And you really feel that. There's something very sun-kissed about this as a painting. He said in an interview at that time with David Sylvester, I felt like all of myself was there. It's the first time he feels that, I think.
And that's what you feel. You still feel it now. And he takes us there with him, which is the joy of this painting. You lift it up and you're planted on the same spot that he was, and you are in his soul. So this is de Kooning, I suppose, at his most expressive. But if we're talking about expressionism, there's another sort, of course, which we can see in a sculpture just on your right shoulder there by Giacometti. And, instantly recognisable, not only by the artist Giacometti, but it's of his brother, Diego, and he used him so often as a model, those wonderful drawings, those really intense drawings. It's typically Giacometti that it's haunting, it's completely static, and yet there is a sense of liveness to it. There's fantastically tactile nature where you can see the artist's fingerprints have gone to make this thin-faced, elongated neck, highly expressionistic, obviously. But there's also something, about this which feels so deeply personal. So although it's, you could call him the Beckett of art, misery in just about everything, or certainly disquiet, there's also, I think, in this sculpture, actually an unusual amount of warmth.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And, we have to look at this steel, this pedestal that he's placed his brother upon, and it seems to me that question about how much can we elevate man? How much can we thrust him, his bust, upon pillars? This is obviously a reference to ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. But how much is the human, the fallible? Where is our space for the fallible within sculpture? And for me, this work, and of course we have the Picasso sculpture, also from 1958, have that similar question at the heart of them.
Yeah, so Giacometti, fragility and uncertainty. Picasso, completely different. This feels, far more assertive, far more confident, and draws back, if you look at the little faces made out here out of a couple of nails, draws back to his surrealist days.
Definitely. And there's also a different sense of play to this. He makes it in 58. He's in La Californie at that point on the Mediterranean coast. He's picking up bits of driftwood. You can see almost the splinters in the wood that have then been cast in bronze. And then you've got the nails, as you say, for a face, and this great phallus. It is a kind of figure that is designed to be provocative, drawing, of course, on the primitivist influences that he's interested in at that time.
It has this rawness that came to be known, I suppose, eventually as art brut, a name given by Jean Dubuffet, who is the creator of the last artwork we're going to look at today. Jean Dubuffet, 1944. He's just started out as a full-time artist, having been a wine merchant. He's yet to go to Switzerland for that moment where he suddenly finds sort of art brut. So what do we have here?
So this is the first large-scale female nude that he makes, and it's a moment in which he's investigating what a different way might be to tackle the human form in this moment just after the end of the occupation of France. We know that the Lascaux caves were discovered in 1940, so there's that real zeal for prehistoric art. So you can see the kind of density of layering of this paint. It's almost as if this woman has been excavated from the paint rather than painted onto the canvas. And she has quite a kind of jovial sort of spirit to her. She's not a romantic figure, but she certainly has a degree of charm. And she was included in the first solo exhibition that he has at the Galerie René Drouin in October of 1944. And the reaction was quite strong. Protesters came to the Place Vendôme. You know, he writes to his friend Jean Paulin about the public outrage for this image. So the charged woman that we see here really hasn't lost any of that edge.
But he's taken things a long way, hasn't he? I mean, you could look at the face and look at the facial features and some of the hands, and you go back to 1932 and Picasso and Marie-Thérèse, and you can see that sort of influence. But he's pushed things so much further in questioning the notion of beauty.
Definitely, and that is really at the heart of this project, is about the idea of, you know, you think Manet's Olympia is scandalous. You know, this is actually in so many ways such a polite painting, and he's aiming to break with those conventions of good taste and provide something that feels like a more honest reality or more honest depiction of the kind of pulse of lived experience.
And I know it's all about the figure, and there's much to talk about the figure, but I'm interested in the background as well, and how that's built up. And what he's saying and doing with that. Absolutely,
and when we were looking at the de Kooning earlier, we were talking about that play with abstraction and the play with landscape, abstracting the spirit of springs. But Dubuffet, like de Kooning, is very much interested in that oscillation between figuration and abstraction, between the figure and the landscape, and really believes that we all exist as part of a continuity, and that as humans we've created this hierarchy between different forms, seen in the different art historical genres, but that actually we all belong to the same universal soup. So when we see this woman, and she's literally made out of the same colours, the same, what he called his pâte or paste, you know, this has been applied with a palette knife. She's made of the same raw ingredients as the background of the painting, and that's really crucial to the philosophy of this work.
Eleanor, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour around this collection. What do you make of it?
I think these are some pretty exceptional works. You know, in each instance, whether it's Polke or Richter or Warhol or Rothko, we're looking at a very special work from across the entirety of their career. And of course, it feels like a real moment now in London, and it's going to be a real moment in New York in May.